Thank you for watching this video about unpleasant welfare arithmetic in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. More than the usual gratitude is owed because, as one of my students recently told me, my public policy papers make him nauseous. I think he really meant that my research findings make him nauseous, in which case I agree because some of the findings are unpleasant. Where I think you'll be unpleasantly surprised is how common it was under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act for people to earn more unemployed than they would employed. In order to make sure that everybody understands how such a situation was possible, let me begin with a few common misperceptions about unemployment insurance. Two misperceptions contained in a single sentence are that when participating in UI, unemployed people have about half their earnings replaced, which still leaves plenty of incentive to get back to work. The second misperception, which is not my topic this morning, is that a 50% implicit tax rate is no disincentive at all. Many economists would argue that's wrong, but again, that's not our topic. What I want to talk about this morning is the misperception that UI participants have only half of their earnings replaced. A related misperception is that the average weekly UI benefit of $300 barely exceeds the compensation from a full-time minimum wage job. Therefore, government help falls far short of the compensation from the job that was lost. Finally, it's often claimed that the macroeconomic effects of the ARRA, ACA, and other recent government assistance programs can be well understood without examining the incentives of people receiving the assistance. We'll see that a little arithmetic casts doubt on, if not refutes, this conventional wisdom. Let's examine what I call job acceptance penalty rates. Consider somebody who was laid off from his or her job, is receiving UI, and is considering a new job. His job acceptance penalty rate is the fraction of compensation on the new job that, in one way or another, goes to public treasuries or to employment expenses as a consequence of accepting the job rather than continuing unemployment. In terms of arithmetic, the penalty rate is the ratio of the penalty to earnings. The penalty is the sum of the dollar amount of payroll taxes owed when working but not when unemployed, the income taxes owed when working but not when unemployed, the UI benefits received when unemployed but not when working, other safety net benefits curtailed as a consequence of the job acceptance, and work expenses. Penalty rates can have different units depending on the concept of earnings used in the denominator. I'll show you two earnings concepts. One is the more familiar earnings before taxes but after fringes. The problem with that concept is that it can be confusing, especially when dealing with public policies that affect fringe benefits. For that reason, I also show you a somewhat less familiar earnings concept, total compensation, and the penalty rates associated with it. It's kind of like measuring things in meters rather than yards. Neither is incorrect per se, but sometimes the metric system can be more useful. Another thing to notice, I am not featuring so-called notches or cliffs here. Notches and cliffs refer to very high tax rates on an additional dollar of income or on another small increment to income. This morning I am not talking about tax rates on small increments, but rather on the entire compensation from a job, fringe benefits and all. An unemployed person's job acceptance penalty rate depends on a number of factors, especially his tax situation. Table 1 shows results for a couple of typical cases. For the purposes of this table only, I assume that the person used to earn $600 per week and in 2009 considered a new job with the same pay. $600 per week is in the middle of the weekly income distribution for working household heads and spouses. The first row of the table assumes, hypothetically, that the 2007 tax and benefit rules had still been in place in 2009, especially that the ARRA had never been passed. The tax situation shown here is a household with 0 earned income tax credit and an 18% personal income tax rate, federal and state combined. The payroll tax, combined for employer and employee, is 15.3%. Employment expenses are $10 per day, or 8% of earnings before taxes and after fringes. UI is 41% after subtracting the income tax that would be owed on it. Federal additional compensation and the COBRA subsidy are 0 because they are part of the ARRA, and the ARRA is excluded from this first row. The combination of all these expenses and foregone benefits is 83% of earnings before taxes and after fringes. Their ratio to total compensation depends on what fringes are received in the new job. I assume one case without employer-provided health insurance and another case with it. The combined penalty rate is either 77% or 61%. The second row looks at the actual tax and benefit rules in 2009 with the Recovery Act in force. FAC is $25 a week, or 3% for someone considering a $600 a week job. Assuming that the prior job offered health insurance, the ARRA's COBRA subsidy is worth 27% of PTAF. The combined penalty rate is either 105% or 84%. The third row considers the results under the hypothetical that the stimulus had been even bigger in terms of the help it gave to the poor and the unemployed. For lack of time this morning, I will not say much about the bigger stimulus results, but you can see them in the paper and might want to look at them if you want a preview of what might happen next year when the full Affordable Care Act goes into effect. The rest of the table repeats the exercise for two other tax situations that are especially different in terms of their position on the earned income tax schedule. This chart is a quick reminder of how the earned income tax credit works. It's a refundable tax credit based on household earnings. The credit rises with calendar year earnings over a range, then is flat, then is phased out, and finally is flat again at 0. It's important to remember that the relevant household earnings here are for the calendar year, and therein lies the irony of this credit. Let's look at some of the arithmetic of calendar years. Someone unemployed for 12 consecutive months still earns during the calendar year, unless he was laid off near January 1. Excluding December and January, 40 million layoffs occurred in 2008 and 2009. Even if someone were laid off near January 1, calendar year earned income can be received through spouses, severance pay, or accumulated sick and vacation pay. Ironically, the unemployed are more likely to qualify for the full earned income tax credit. Among those currently and recently employed, almost all qualify for the full making work pay tax credit. Thus, while my Table 1 shows both the EITC phase-in and phase-out situations, you should recognize that the phase-in situation is rare. In reality, there are more than 3 tax situations. I cannot fit them all in a table, but I did put them in a computer and can summarize the results. Table 3 shows the programs and parameters that are included in my calculations. I want to note a few relevant assumptions here. I give a heavy discount to Medicaid benefits because economists typically presume that Medicaid participants would not buy the coverage with their own money. Also note that federal personal income tax credits are among the programs included. Among other things, the Making Work Pay tax credit is included, even though I ultimately cannot conclude that the Recovery Act made work pay. Table 4 shows the first results. The table is counting all household heads and spouses who were working in 2007 and asks what their job acceptance penalty rate would be if, hypothetically, they were laid off and were considering accepting a new job while the Recovery Act was in effect. Results are shown for 3 different sets of tax and benefit rules. The middle columns show the actual rules under the ARRA. The left columns show the hypothetical case that 2007 tax and benefit rules had remained in place through 2010. The right columns show the hypothetical case of a bigger stimulus. Everyone is put into a bin according to his or her job acceptance penalty rate. My purpose this morning is to give extra attention to the largest penalty rates. Recall that 100% plus means that a person gains nothing in the short term, not even fringe benefits, from accepting a new job with the same pay. Under 2007 rules, we would have had 900,000 workers out of a total of 96 million who would have had a penalty rate of at least 100%. Under actual rules, 3 million would have been in that position. For convenience, the table also displays the impact of having one set of tax and benefit rules rather than another. The impact is calculated as a subtraction. On the row above, I have the numbers of people in the 90 to 99% category. Under the Recovery Act, 4.8 million people would be in that category. The cumulative column accumulates the rows with the rows below it. For example, 7.8 million people would, if laid off and considering a new position during the ARRA, have had a penalty rate of 90% or greater. Table 4's job acceptance penalty rates are also layoff subsidy rates, in that they tell us what fraction of a worker's compensation would be replaced by the safety net in the event that he were laid off. I don't have time this morning to talk much about this or how to adjust for the experience rating of regular unemployment benefits, but layoff subsidy rates are important for understanding why the number of layoffs fluctuates over time. Table 5 changes from the job acceptance penalties after hypothetical layoffs to penalties after actual layoffs. Each person is counted in this calculation only if he was laid off sometime between mid-2008 and the end of 2009. As before, the top panel considers the penalty for accepting a position that paid the same as the previous job. But a lot of displaced workers cannot reasonably expect to find a job that paid that well. Some estimates say that displaced workers experience 17% pay cuts on average. I have therefore added a bottom panel that considers the penalty for accepting a position that paid 17% less than the previous one. I've circled the cumulative columns with penalty rates in the neighborhood of 100%. About 5 million layoffs of household heads and spouses presented people with penalty rates in the neighborhood of 100%, and perhaps 11 million people were presented with penalties in excess of 80%. I think 5 million is a large number. To put that in perspective, remember that the total 2007 to 2010 change in the number of household heads and spouses unemployed was 4.6 million. Let's take the 3.6 million right here and look at the various policies that, in combination, essentially confiscate their employee compensation. I've taken the categories you saw in the first table, like payroll tax, personal income tax, unemployment insurance, and then some, and stacked them vertically. The combined height of the bar is the total penalty rate I showed in the previous table, which averages almost exactly 100% for the roughly 4 million observations I'm showing you here. I mentioned before that there are interactions among the various programs, like between UI and the personal income tax. So there is not a unique way to allocate the total penalty to individual programs. But you get the basic idea that UI foregone is an important category, but still less than half of the help that these people were getting after their layoff. Now let me show you what would have happened if these same people had been exposed to the 2007 tax and benefit rules. The white space here is a worker's short-term financial reward to accepting a job. It's not large, but it's something. As we see on the left, the ARRA took that reward away. You're starting to see why unpleasant is part of my title today. Labor markets with high implicit tax rates are more vulnerable to demand shocks. 100% taxation is a disaster. That and basic arithmetic are two things Milton Friedman and James Tobin agreed on. I like the way Tobin put it. He was, by the way, the leading Keynesian economist of his day and an important advisor to President Kennedy during a recession. He said that 100% tax rates cause needless waste and demoralization. This application of the means test, he said, is bad economics as well as bad sociology. He said that it is almost as if our present programs of public assistance had been consciously contrived to perpetuate the conditions they are supposed to alleviate. I don't think Tobin was an expert on policymakers' motivations. I certainly am not. The economic point here is that if, hypothetically, one wanted to prolong unemployment, prolong poverty, and prolong a recession, the 100% tax is one of the most potent tools that could be used. If you presume, as I do, that prolonging these conditions is not the objective, then 100% tax rates are a regrettable and costly mistake. Please don't infer from my remarks this morning that 100% tax rates are all that you need to know to understand labor market incentives. For that exercise, you'd want to look at all of the tax rates, not just those at or beyond 100%. The trick with tax rates of, say, 60% is that arithmetic is no longer sufficient to make the case. You need to say more about likely behavioral responses. That's the exercise I pursued in my recent book about redistribution in the labor market over the past 5 years. Thank you.